All right, welcome back for another episode of the Fleet Success Show. Joined today, you've got your host, Josh Turley, and your other co-host, Steve Saltzgiver.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while since you've been in studio. I know, have you been on a podcast yet since we've flipped it around?
I've been on a podcast for the 100 Best Fleets.
No, that's right. You did the one.
but not with you.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the first time for a while.
Yeah, so Steve was in town doing a consulting gig for somebody here locally, and we thought we'd take advantage of the moment and get us both in studio. And obviously we've got the video set up now, so you guys get to actually see what our recording studio looked like back in when we were running all those 100 episodes that we did before.
Yeah,
so,
you get to see our radio face.
That's right. Our radio face and everything else. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about, culture, right? Which I know is a big shock for everybody. We really do try to, on this podcast, kind of blend those elements of, what it takes to be a successful fleet, what it takes to, as we manage those 4 pillars. And the one pillar we feel like doesn't get enough attention in the rest of the world. So maybe we talk about it a lot because of that, is how do you build a culture? But specifically today, we wanted to tell some war stories, right? And kind of speak to those who are in the middle of it, or, you've tried doing it and you're still, you're just struggling with it. And you're wondering, is this worth it? Is it worth it to go through all the pain and hassle of really trying to establish an intentional culture? And so I wanted to kind of tell our story, right, as we've transitioned and gone through this, definition and really built out the culture as it is today, because it was a mess. It was a messy transition.
Well, if you've ever tried to do it, it's very painful.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time, and you have to be patient.
Yep. So, it just kind of set the stage a little bit, because there's probably a lot of people who didn't know what RTA used to be like. There's probably several who used to, they've been with us since the 90s. And my dad, this was his company at the time, and he had a very, laissez-faire kind of culture, right? Very family oriented. And everybody knows, and it was a toxic kind of family oriented culture.
Dysfunctional family.
Dysfunctional family is exactly right. Everybody's got that uncle or that crazy brother or whatever, right? And you can't ever do anything about it because they're family. And we kind of had that same mentality. But I remember, and I don't know who wrote this. I want to say there was a Harvard Business Review article that talked about the toxicity of family cultures, right? Because family kind of implies permanence,
right?
That it's a permanent arrangement, permanent relationship you have with the people you work with. Tolerance, right, for everything that goes on. Oh, that's just so-and-so. That's how they are, right? And some of you might be chuckling because you're like, oh yeah, I've had that. In fact, I have that right now, right? Oh, Jim Bob, that's just how he is, right? You excuse bad behavior because it's family. So that was definitely what culture was like at RTA for a long time. And that was, when I started, that's how it was. But I remember, we had some positions we just couldn't keep people in them, good people. We'd make hires and they were good talent, but dad didn't pay enough and they would, end up leaving for something better. Or he would ask too much, or he would, we just couldn't get good talent in the door. And when it did come in, we couldn't keep it. We had a really solid core group of guys in the support team. We had the people who did stay. That was the interesting thing. The people who stayed for life. And so the question you have to ask is, well, who was staying, right?
Yep.
And it wasn't that, these guys were terrible people or anything, but they were what the company needed at the time. Is probably the best way to say it. Dad definitely valued loyalty, and I think that was more about his self, it was more about his, what's the word I'm looking for? Not necessarily self-worth, but his self-identity, right? It was that people were loyal to him. They were loyal to the company. And that's kind of how he validated himself in some ways, is the love of others, right?
Well, I think that there was a generation where loyalty really mattered.
Yeah.
And now
you hear that, right? People staying at a company for 30 some odd years. And
even me, I'm an older generation, I guess, baby boomer, but I've moved around dozens of times now, which is unusual for my generation.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the way it was. You went to work for IBM or somebody and you stayed there until you retired.
Yeah. And the company would take care of you if they had some kind of pension plan or something like that,
But I think the environment's changed now. I think things are moving much quicker.
Yeah.
And people need to stay on top of their game a little better than they used to.
Well, so I think
Yeah.
that's something that really did happen, right? When I talk about like the people who stayed, one of the big things that I noticed was that we weren't pushing for people to stay marketable,
Yep.
right? They stayed because like they had job security and they had, like they offered something in that position, but they didn't make the position any better. They didn't really take the position and transform it into something that it could have been. It was more like they kept the lights on, they kept us running, and just like kept things moving. Um, but like keeping skills marketable was not on the agenda. So a lot of people, and I think Dad almost felt endeared as like, well, now I'm responsible for this person for life. As they came on payroll and they stayed forever, right? Because
Yep.
they couldn't go get another job somewhere else. They didn't have the skill set to do it.
Yeah, well, I think the economy and the business environment, everything is just moving at such a rapid pace now.
Yeah,
You have to stay on top of this, and you
yeah,
have to be able to be marketable.
yeah,
I mean, I remember when we rolled out the LinkedIn.
yeah,
Most people equate that with their business, right?
yeah.
And I don't mean we rolled it out, but I mean we started doing some things on LinkedIn, and we started saying, "Market yourself,"
Yeah.
that's a foreign
The
concept.
brand, like
Yeah,
your personal brand, right? Like
exactly.
invest in your personal brand.
So
Yeah.
that means you have to get training, you have to go out and continue reading, you have to continue
Yeah.
improving, so you
Well,
can
and
be
you have to
marketable.
take personal responsibility for that,
Absolutely.
right? And we had that where people weren't taking personal responsibility for themselves. Um, but also like, and this is, for you leaders, is you have to give them the opportunity to do it,
Yep.
right? And not feel, that you're somehow encouraging them to leave. Maybe you should. I think that's, if there's been a shift in how I treat people, it's that, right? It's like, I look at people and say, okay, where do they need to be in 2 to 3 years? And how do I need to help get them there? Right. I can't take responsibility, but I can absolutely facilitate. And so like I've got a junior leader right now that I'm looking at that, in 2 to 3 years, she should be at the next level. Now that might not be at my company.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of leaders out there that kind of hold back their team because they're afraid of losing good talent. Whereas if you're truly an unselfish leader, you would invest in that team member and hope if you need that position filled, they're ready for it, right? So you're developing your bench. But if you don't need that position filled and you're good, then you either have a different spot on the bus or you're helping them go find their spot on the bus, right? Like, let's go find a bus you can drive and not just ride along on, right?
I've always kind of believed in the universe principle.
Yeah.
Things happen the way they need to happen.
Yep.
And, and when someone's ready, they'll step up. If they're not ready, they'll move on.
Yeah.
And if they move on, you'll find someone else.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems to me like things just kind of coordinate. Maybe it's just my positive attitude towards that, but I've never had that fail on me really.
Yeah.
And I remember the conversation we had, this is my third year month,
Yeah.
my anniversary month. And before I even joined RTA, this conversation we're having about culture is when we started with.
Yeah.
Because I always believed in an intentional culture, but I worked in areas in government and organizations where it was like impossible to do that I still tried.
Yeah.
And I still helped people find their ultimate position, even when I was in government, and got people to transition out to where they could be happy.
Right.
Or improve in where we were at, and become part of that culture. So that was an exciting thing for me that someone is actually trying to do that, which is originally why I joined RTA.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think that, let's talk about that transition. So, you fast forward 2012, 2013, right? Dad's been running this thing for 30 years. He's built up the type of environment he wants to have, right? Which every leader should do. He gets sick, he passes away. And, ultimately, like, I end up taking this thing over, and like, we floundered, that was 14, and we didn't know what we were doing. Nobody had ever, told us about intentional culture, told us about, core values or anything like that. And I had read Good to Great in college, it was one of our required readings, but I hadn't really read it. And I think that's sometimes true, right? Is that sometimes somebody puts a lesson in front of us and we're not ready to receive it. I've got a coach named Dan Martell, and he says things like, it's not about what's taught, it's about what's caught. And I wasn't ready to catch that. Right. But you fast forward a few years and like, I can just tell, like we've been going through the hiring gauntlet, and it's just been rough. Like we haven't found good talent. We bring people on, and then we're not happy with how things are going because we didn't know how to screen for it. We were only looking at job resumes, which I'm sure many of us went through that process. Um, and I'll never forget, I was sitting in, I think I was doing entree leadership at the time. Like I had just gotten into entree leadership. And it was just like finally clicking, right? Because they preach a lot of culture, with that group. And I was ready to hear it, right? And it finally clicked for me as like, I have to get really intentional about the type of people we want to bring on the bus. And all these problems that I'm having are because I'm not holding people accountable because I don't feel like I can. And I haven't been clear yet with, with what those things are. Right. So as we're going through and doing this transition, I stumble across Patrick Lencioni at one of these entree leadership events, and I hear his whole thing on ideal team player, which if you want to find out what that's all about, go out to, stay on YouTube right here. Just go search Lencioni TED Talk, and he'll have a thing in there about the ideal team player. Yep. And he talks about these 3 virtues of what it takes to be an ideal team player. And I remember just falling in love. His presentation style is wonderful.
Right.
Like he's a good, easy listener.
Like even the books.
He's energetic.
Right. They follow along. They're easy.
Yeah.
They make sense.
Yeah. And I'd already been making changes with the leadership team. Like I had wanted, like more professionalism. I knew I needed certain skill sets. So I had been bringing people in that I knew I wanted to work with. Right. And so kind of inadvertently, I had been creating a culture. I just hadn't clarified. Like I hadn't defined it. I didn't say what it was. It was just like people I could get along with. That was the bar of entry into RTA. Can I get along with you? If I can, like we're going to be fine, right? We'll figure it out. And you're smart and I respect you and things like that. But I'll never forget, like when we finally committed to, okay, no, we're going to clarify what are our core values at RTA. And we went through a whole word cloud exercise, where we like threw a bunch of words up on there. And everything we ended up doing, like we ultimately all felt was like, oh, well, that's just a part of being humble, and that's just a part of being hungry, and that's a part of being people smart.
Yep.
And so that's how we settled on humble, hungry, and smart. And from that day onward, we knew that was the standard we were holding ourselves to, because it was a standard we felt like we were already living, most of us. But it was a standard we knew we wanted to commit to, is that like this is what we are going to be.
And
right.
I think it's served us well.
Absolutely.
3 years I've been here. I think everyone, as you've gone through the transition and people have transitioned out, they're lacking one of those values.
Almost every time. Yeah.
So, it's, and personally, it's hard to have all 3 of those values sometimes.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with customers and when you're dealing with coworkers, but you have to keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah. And we're allowed to slip.
Yeah.
We just can't stay there. Right. Yeah. And that's something we tell each other all the time.
I think that's any good culture. You have to allow some level of tolerance for someone to slip occasionally. Right. Because they'll disappoint you. They'll excite you. That's just the human nature, but it's the consistency that you're after in the long run.
Yeah. And for us, like the big thing was, like we really honed in, and we didn't necessarily dismiss job skills and all that. But it became very clear that like the most important thing to us had to be the core values. And so we went through this transition period. We had a ton of people on the bus who didn't fit those, they didn't reach that level of, what we were expecting from a behavior standpoint. And I think that's why we had to start there, right? So if you're going through a transition and you're trying to define an intentional culture, for me, it always starts with behavior.
Yep.
And then we can get into job performance and all of that stuff later. But if you can't talk about these 3 core, these 3 virtues, right? If somebody's not coachable, if they're not motivated, if they're just a jerk in the shop, right? Like those are, in my mind, that's like the bare minimum here at RTA. And it should be, in my mind, the bare minimum for most of these places that we work.
Well, that was one of the things that impressed me coming aboard. We did a behavioral analysis, right?
Yeah.
We use those. We dissect them. We understand what we are and who we are.
Yeah.
And we compare ourselves to each other, where we're weak, where we're strong.
Yep.
I think at the very least, any culture can do that.
Yeah.
And at least as a starting point to figure out where you need to improve.
Yeah. Well, and that's, because we started that journey a year before you joined, right? And so as you're coming in, you're seeing all these things happen, right? And it was because of this experience that we'd had going through and realizing, oh crap, like we let crazy into the building,
Right.
and now it's in the building, and it's hard to root out because it's like a tick and it gets dug in, right? And sometimes you got to light a match on that sucker to get it back out. And we kind of felt that same thing. And so we started realizing is that, we can't really take care of the people that are here, but what we can do is like, let's build a process for letting people into the building.
Right.
And that was the first thing, is like, we got to put the gates up. And once the wall's up, then we can start working on the insides, right? Because
I think if you've been through any management training or leadership training, those behavior analysis are pretty wide.
Yeah.
And they're used frequently. And so most
and you're
leaders,
talking like the disc profiles,
right?
and
Most
personality
people,
profiles,
all those things. And I mean, most leaders have probably taken those.
Yeah.
And they probably haven't shared them with their teams typically.
Right.
But that's where I think we try to get from the top to the bottom on those. And I think it's been helpful.
It's been huge.
And it's been insightful for me, even. I've taken several.
Yeah.
And I have to keep looking at them.
And every once in a while they shift.
They do
right?
shift a little bit.
Yeah. Or, you'll do something and you'll be like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like me. And it creates a whole conversation.
Well, I think you grow.
Yeah.
And I think the culture and the synergy in the culture helps you grow.
Yeah.
Where your weaknesses are.
Yeah.
And that's part of our culture where we tell the kind truth.
Yeah.
So if we slip, we tell people.
Yeah.
And if you tell the kind truth and you don't take it personal, the person receiving it,
yeah,
it's an opportunity to grow. It's an opportunity to change, or an opportunity to transition yourself out.
Yeah.
Either way, right?
Yeah.
So,
and those transitions are hard,
yeah.
And like I think back to, 2017, 2018, 19, like that was when we were really in the thick of our transition. And we still had a long ways to go. Even when you came in, there was still a lot of work that we had to do. But I remember having to make some of those decisions, and some of them I had made just because financially prudent. They were financially prudent decisions. But others, it was hard because of the family aspect of it, and I was really trying to rip that out. But doing that, like I was a part of that family, right? And so for me, it was really difficult to let go of some of these people that had been either my bosses or had, been people that I'd rubbed shoulders with for 10 plus years. And I had to learn very quickly what it truly meant to be a leader and not just a part of the family, and being able to recognize, this is the hardest lesson I think that leaders have to learn, is to separate themselves without becoming distant.
Yeah.
Like you have to be able to make the hard decision. And I'm trying to remember the show. You remember that show? It was a submarine show with Matthew McConaughey, U-571 or something like that.
Yeah,
they basically had to take over
remember,
the German U-boat, right?
Is it Das Boot?
Das Boot, yeah. And so,
something.
But I remember there was a scene in that movie, and basically, like there was somebody who had to shut the hatch in order to keep the compartment from flooding, and he condemned, a few other sailors to die.
Yeah.
Right. And the leadership lesson that Matthew McConaughey had to learn was being willing to do that. Right. Is being willing to make decisions that are going to cost people their lives, and being willing to sacrifice, a few people for the good of the boat and for the good of the rest of the crew. Right. Because that's ultimately like, that's life and death. It's, the stakes are.
I mean, and that does happen in the military.
Yeah.
And I mean, not probably as serious in an organization like ours, but you have to be able to make those tough calls.
Yeah. And as a leader, exactly, not as serious as ours, right? And if you're in fleet, it's not going to be life or death typically.
I mean, the sacrifice someone transitioning out is like death in the organization, right?
But yes, that's what it feels like. You're feeling like you're ripping out this relationship, and because you've allowed this permanence to come in, it hurts. It's a great friend that you just had to say you're not good enough, and we have to let you go, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so painful. And that, is part of the intentional culture we built too, is like, I don't want to have that conversation, right? We have a culture now about, we try to be really clear about where you're falling short, to the point that it becomes so uncomfortable having that hard conversation that you either quit, or by the time we say, okay, this just isn't working, we need to let you go, it's not a surprise.
Well,
right?
And you've done a pretty good thing too with the investment. If you're not comfortable here, we'll pay you X to leave or transition.
Yeah,
out.
that 60-day check.
Yeah, and I think something like that, that right away. I mean, if you don't get it in 60 days, you're not going to get it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good cultural check to where people need to really take a good hard look at themselves.
Yeah.
And leaders.
Yeah.
Look at the employees. And
it's interesting, right? In the era of, signing bonuses
Yeah.
and things like that, here we are. We don't give a signing bonus. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to pay you to quit.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're going to actually ask you to turn down money to stay at this job.
Yep.
It's so backwards.
It was interesting when you did that a few years ago when we all tore up a check.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at that check and you go, I could really use that.
And that was another big transition moment, right? Yeah. And like it was a fairly big chunk of change, you know, for some people. And
I mean, just the physical, you printing them out and hand them to us. And
oh man, I had so many people that were mad about that. They felt offended. Like, how dare I question their loyalty that they, and I'm like, no, I need this to be so symbolic.
It needs to be,
that, and it's tangible that you hold it in your hand, and I did. I had one guy quit that day, and
I remember.
It was not the guy I expected to quit, but I think that was one of the fun things about the transition too. Right. And I love that you were here for that. Was we had a lot of people in the culture still, right? Like we built up the walls. And now we were working on transitioning those people out. And we still had several core, team members that have been with us, 10, 15 years that weren't quite getting the hint. But that moment when I gave everybody 10% of their annual salary, right? And I think the next month I came back and offered them 20% of their annual salary to quit, right? And I said, if that wasn't enough money, I'll do 20%. Could you imagine that? Somebody coming to you and giving you,
in some cases, it's almost like buying a car, right?
Yeah.
Some people, that's pretty
depends on the car.
Hunk of change.
I got a story about that.
That's true.
I'm going to post on LinkedIn about that one later. But what that did for me in that moment was, as a leader, and really for us as a leadership team, right? It gave us permission to hold them accountable, as they had all basically agreed, yes, I want to be a part of this culture and I'm willing to meet these standards. Right. And so we could turn up the intensity on it. And that was a big turning moment for us. Was when we did do that? 2021. It was right after we came back from COVID. Because it was at that moment. It was like, hey guys, like I know things are crazy right now, and I know it's all weird, but like you gotta want to be here. And I don't need anybody here that's just here for the job. Right? You're here for a paycheck. There's a lot of places you can go earn a paycheck. Like here, it's got to be about like desire and passion, and you got to want to be here, not just, hey, as long as Josh is signing the checks, we're good. That's not life at RTA. So I mean, it's, that if you're going through that transition or you want to go through it, like just know if you've had that family culture, it's going to be painful ripping people out. But I will tell you, is we get here to this other side of it. Right. And I look back at, the leadership teams that I've gone through. People actually made a joke the other day. They're like, I don't know that I want to be on Josh's executive team. Because the tenure is so short. Right. And it took a little bit, and like it stung a touch, but it also was like, every time I've done it, we've gotten better and we've up leveled, and the company is transitioning because of our commitment to that culture, and really our commitment to hold our leaders to the highest possible standard.
If you do it right, though, I mean, I've had 2 positions on the leadership team, and now I'm not.
Yeah.
If you do it right, I have no grudge or anything. I don't feel slighted in the least. I know that where I'm at now is where I need to be,
and where you were at before. Yeah. Where's where you needed to be.
Exactly. I mean, I think you have to keep that in mind. You're not. It's not a given or a guarantee or an entitlement, as we see in a lot, in the world now.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember having a conversation just last week with one of my grandsons. I'm entitled to this. And I'm going, what? I mean, I was like, I thought my ears were grating on a cheese grater. I'm going, what? Nobody's entitled to anything, And it was just a funny conversation. And hopefully by the end time I got done with it, I got him straightened out. But I mean, you see that so much now.
Yeah.
Where people just believe they're entitled. And
like I deserve this. And
and that is huge toxicity to a culture when someone becomes entitled.
It's a big piece of why we talk about it during our onboarding. That was another piece that I added was within their first 60 days, like we do a drink the Kool-Aid meeting, right? We like to say we put the cult in culture because we really want you to know what you're signing up for here, right? And I talk all about the core values, and one of them is that entitlement free.
Yep.
We set it out like you were born in one of the greatest countries on earth with, the absolute freedom to go do anything.
Yep.
You don't have anything to complain about. There are things that trust me, the country's got problems. We got things to work on, but I wouldn't rather be anywhere else,
But ultimately, you're in control of your own destiny.
and that's what I love here.
Yes.
Right. And I think we should all be grateful for that opportunity that we've been given that we did not earn.
Yep.
We did not. I mean, like, hey, good job. You were born in the U.S. You're a citizen. You passed the test.
We won the lottery, essentially.
It's exactly what it is, right?
Yep.
Like, you could have been born in North Korea. You could have been born in, right now, you look at what's going on in Eastern Europe. Like, you look at, the children in Africa, they don't even have clean water to drink.
Yep.
And yet I can go right now into...
That's still the number one death of people.
Yeah.
Lack of clean water.
Yeah.
And it's a shame.
And I could drink water out of the toilet right now to be cleaner than what they have to deal with over there, right? And we just take that for granted. And that's that entitlement mentality. It's just, you can't take things for granted anymore, So we're really big on, like, we teach that from day one. But still, people fall. It's human nature, I think. You fall to it. So, but yeah, that was a big piece of it. Doing the 60-day onboarding, the 2021, buyout offer that we did. Now we do that for everybody at their 60-day mark.
What were you telling me just a little bit ago? You have how many left now from the original culture?
Yeah. So if I think back, right, Dad passed away in 2014. We had 25 employees at the time. Of those 25, which I was one, 4 of us are still here.
Yeah.
Right. Now, mind you, we've doubled the size of the company.
Right.
So just by osmosis alone, right, like, we've brought in, just a different level of talent, a different skill set, a different mindset, different attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, right? And the culture has really taken on its own life. Like, the culture is now getting created by those people. It's not something I have to sit up front and preach.
Right.
It's something that they've adopted because they want to work in a place like that. And they've taken ownership of the culture as much as I have. But so we've doubled the size of the company, but then of those original 25, only 4 are left, which means that in addition to the osmosis, we flushed out, and there were some good people in that list. I'm not going to, besmirch them all, but like, we just had a lot of people that I think somebody once called them, it was like we had a lot of dead wood in our company. It was wood that just wasn't growing anymore.
It would be interesting to maybe just select a couple that washed out of here and look where they are now and see if they've grown.
Yeah, I know one of them, like, they were on a leadership position here and then ended up, like, in a critical leadership position here. And the best job they were able to get was, working like running a local retail store, and that's the kind of thing, like, we had promoted some incompetent, I mean, some of them, like, they're lucky they're not in jail, but, it's been, like, that type of incompetence was kind of rampant. It was sad. Yeah. Because there was so much opportunity that we could have taken advantage of and grown, but those personal relationships just trumped everything. And so the company was, it's like an engine that was starving for oxygen, willfully.
Yep.
And that was just the sad thing about it, was that, and that was the lesson I had to learn as a leader, was I had to put my personal feelings aside for the good of the business, because the people were depending on that. And that's not easy as a leader, right? Is to take on that kind of responsibility to set your own personal comfort aside for the betterment of everybody around you.
Well, it's hard to put your emotions ever in check, right?
Yeah, no,
especially
really
when
hard.
You're leading people, working with people. But as a leader, you have to sometimes.
Yeah.
So
it's been a fun transition. I will tell you, is I wouldn't trade it for anything. If I were to come into a company, that would be the very first thing I would do, right? Is like, let's evaluate. Now, I would want to, before I go into a company, evaluate where the culture's at and things like that. But it would absolutely be the first thing I do is going out and build the intentional culture. Like, what kind of environment are we trying to create here? And then once I have that set, then it's applying the filter to the people who are there. Get those walls up so you're only attracting those type of people in the beginning. And you have to have people, there's a, like, I'll call it a transition, because of the, we started with the 25, and then, here we are at the 50 we have today. But in between then, there was a lot of, like, in and out, right? And those in and outs were, they were people who kind of fit the mold, but they were enough to help drive out some of the older crew, but not enough to meet the standard that we wanted to be at, right? So they were a little bit of a transition. Um, so you might find that where, because here's the deal, the people that we have today would have never come and worked for us, back in 2017, 2018, just would have happened.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes like there is a transition period where you have to be, you have to have a little slack, you have to have a little adoption, because if you preach culture, 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 and then you bring in these new hires and you're allowing all the old culture to remain the way it was, it's going to be a little bit of a juxtaposition, right? It's going to be a little bit of hypocrisy.
Yep.
And you'll lose credibility. And so you have to just be kind of clear, is like, this is the type of environment we're trying to create, but we got some people here that have been here 30 some odd years. They might be protected by union CBAs. There might be any number of things that are handcuffing you into building this thing.
Well, I think you got to do the long play,
but you take the long approach.
I mean, it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
I mean, even since I've been here, only 3 years total. Yeah. I mean, I've seen so many changes just to get where we are today.
Yeah.
And I think you need to lay out that expectation.
Yeah.
And if you're in maybe in a government culture, it might take longer than that.
Exactly.
Right. But if you're a new fleet manager and you're there and you think you're going to spend another 10 to 15 years, it's all doable.
Invest today.
Yeah. Invest today and start today. And, and you'll have some retirements and you'll have some people terminating themselves and you can eventually get there. I mean, it is possible.
Yep. And I think that's the key, is just, be persistent, have faith. And it's like working out and dieting, right? It feels so simple, but at the same time, it's the hardest thing to do. Well, why? Because it takes discipline, it takes effort, persistence. And it's tough to stick with that sometimes,
We met with a culture, you were talking about why I'm here, we met with a team, a fleet management team. And one of their problems, the way they called us in, is they had experienced some toxicity. And they brought in a leader about 4 or 5 years ago, and he's kind of completely turned around the toxicity, but now they're starting anew now to try and get the fleet where it needs to be.
Yeah.
So they have some of the players, because they had to get rid of a lot of players, but that also put them on the back burner to become efficient on the fleet side. So,
and that's, and that's like the transition. If you're thinking about this, right? Like the first thing is fix, it's a who, not how, right? You got to start with the players on your team. Because, like you can't expect the players that you have, if they're not culture fits, you're never going to get them. You're never going to be able to pull them to a high performance standard, right? Yeah. That just won't happen. So you have to focus first on the who. Get the right players in the team, and it's going to take a little while. And like you said, efficiency might take a backseat. Yep. And this is the transition we just went through. Was now that we've kind of established the baseline for the values, then we took it up a notch and we said, okay, great, culture's where it needs to be. Now we need to add another element to this, and that's the performance, right? And we finally added, and I've talked about this on another podcast episode, but we added that filter of, do they do work that impresses me, right? Or, is there, like, maybe they're in the wrong job, maybe they're in the wrong role, maybe, whatever, right? But like, how does their work impress me on a scale of 1 to 10? And then you compare that with, how are they doing on the True Believer Index? Do they believe in what we're doing here? Do they want to be here? How well did they fit? And we added that additional metric, to the way that we evaluate the team members. And that is another thing. It's already started to transition us to the next level of the RTA culture, right? It's not enough just to have the behaviors. Now you got to have the performance to match it. And that's how you build a high octane, high performing culture. But you've got to start with a base layer foundation of getting the right people.
I mean, some of you out there it's an evolution.
Yep.
And some of you might feel like you're doing whack-a-mole sometimes, out there, because it's like, well, I got rid of that guy and he was the worst. And boy, this guy just popped up, It's like, when is this going to end?
Yeah.
But it will end at some point if you stay with your values and you stay with, what you're true to, or at least it'll get close. It may not ever end because, human nature is what it is. But I've seen that throughout my career, it's like, whenever I've got rid of that toxic person, another toxic person pops onto the radar.
Yeah.
Someone you hadn't been paying attention to.
Well, and it's like, what's the old analogy? You don't have to be the fastest person. If you're running away from a bear, you just have to be faster than the slowest person. Yeah. Well, and I think that's what happens, right? Yeah. Is like the bear gets him.
Yeah.
And guess what? He's not done eating. And now, now you're the slowest person.
That's a great analogy.
Right. I mean, I think that's what happens though in a culture is like, sometimes you're focused on one person and then they're out. and then you got to go to the next person and they're out, right? Like, and it takes a lot of time and patience and just long suffering. But hey, you're a leader. That's what we signed up for.
Yep.
Right. If the job was easy, everybody would do it.
Exactly.
But I just want, everybody listening or watching, right? Like, you have support, you have people that have been through this, you have people who are now on the other side of this. And we can show you success stories of like what it looks like when you have that culture and why it's so worth investing in, even with how painful it can be. But if you need somebody to kind of pick you up or anything, we're here.
Yep. So, I mean, and certainly reach out to us.
Yeah.
As we've gone through it. I mean, I've been going through this personally for 35, 40 years.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. This isn't the first cultural transformation you've been a part of, right?
Yeah. So it is the best one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, you learn and you want to be where you can be the best, improving yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, that I've grown a lot just in 3 years being here.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, because you would think I'm an old dog, but what new tricks could I learn? But it happens.
Oh no, we definitely know Steve can learn some new tricks. We've definitely tested him and pushed him, and and it's
especially with technology.
Well, I think COVID did a lot of that to us too, right? Like,
absolutely.
How's this Zoom thing work?
Yeah.
So, well, guys, thank you very much. Tuning in today. Again, if you need help or you want to talk through, like, how do I establish an intentional culture? Why should I establish an intentional culture? I can't reiterate enough how much fun it is to come into work every day because of the people and the team that we've built around ourselves, right? Especially in this last year, and our culture did that, right? Like, we brought on some incredible people from industry.
Well, people hear about it.
Yeah, because they hear through the grapevine and they see what's going on. They're like, hey, right? And like, I've been at speaking engagements and somebody comes up to me and they're like, I see what you're doing over there at RTA and I want to be a part of it.
Yep.
Right. Like, if anything comes open, I want to know about it. Right. And they're constantly looking. In fact, I've got one guy who's, he's constantly reaching out. Hey, do you have a position open yet? Like, he really wants to come be a part of this because he's seen it. He's drawn to it. And just as soon as there's a position that opens up that we have a need for, like, I know he's going to be first in line to apply. And that's when we talk about true believers, those are the kinds of people you want to go to war with, right? When you don't have anything but the guy in the foxhole next to you, like, you want guys that you can rely on, guys and gals. I say that, generically, thank you. But it is absolutely worth the investment. So, if you're questioning yourself, you're questioning this, or you look at us and say, these guys are always talking about culture. It's just too critical. It's too important. Life's too short. It's too short to work with people you don't like. It's too short to work on projects that you're not having fun at. There's always more opportunity in places.
It's too short to be at a job you don't like, or
working for a leader you don't like.
Yeah. I'll end with this a little bit. I know we're trying to wrap up, but I have let's just put it this way. One of my sons who's hated every boss he's ever had.
Yeah.
Now, what does that tell me?
Yep.
Where's the problem?
What's the common denominator in all those situations?
So, I mean, you have to ask yourself that, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, if you're that employee and you've always had the same problem, someone has to change.
Yeah.
And it may be you.
Yep. There may be a mindset.
I mean, I've had to change myself.
Yeah.
Many times because of things like that. So,
well, and it's interesting too, because we all have this baggage, right? And we've seen that when people come on board here at RTA, is sometimes they're like, this can't be real, or this isn't right.
Right.
And as they're bringing into the situation their own baggage, and we have to like help them release it and let it go and change and figure out, like, what do you need to work on, right? Because maybe it is that you've been the problem in all these relationships. How can we help you overcome that? Because it's going to hurt your relationships here.
Absolutely.
So it is interesting sometimes how that those baggage that comes through, and it can poison you sometimes.
And frankly, we all have some.
Yeah.
And I think you just need to understand, how can I get rid of some of that?
Yeah. Well, and how do you keep that baggage from affecting the rest of the culture?
Exactly.
So, all right, guys. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us today. As always, be sure to check us out on the Fleet Success Show. Share it with your friends. Go check out the Fleet Success Playbook. Half that book is dedicated to building an intentional culture. All the frameworks, the meeting cadences, how to set up, job postings and core values. And any of you who are struggling with technician retention or recruiting, it starts here. It starts with culture. Like, this is the number one problem that's been facing Fleet for 10 years. And yet we're not doing the things we need to do about it, which is building a culture that attracts and retains the type of talent that we want. Um, and the opportunity, if you do this because nobody else is doing it, if you're willing to do the hard work, I guarantee you're going to have success in recruiting and retaining your best talent, because you're going to get them from the other guys who aren't doing the work,
Yep.
who are putting up with, Jim Bob, who doesn't want to do the work, right? They're putting up with that type of behavior. Thoroughbreds don't want to run with donkeys.
Yep.
Right. That's an old Kentucky Derby saying, right? Like thoroughbreds don't run with donkeys. And if you got donkeys in the stable, your thoroughbreds are going to kick and scream against it, and they're going to leave. So
last thing I'll say is intentional culture rocks. I mean, it is literally a game changer.
Yep. All right. We'll see you next time. Thank you.